Hi, everybody. I am Christy Craig. I'm the publisher here at Hidden Timber Books. Welcome to this Sunday afternoon reading. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I just want to give you a little bit of information. These small press author readings are really an opportunity for you to meet authors from all over the country and beyond and get to know some other small presses that are publishing great authors and great stories as well. It's kind of a way to build a community of writers and readers among us. So I am thrilled to have Ginger Eager today online to share about her book, The Nature of Remains. And I'll just give you a little bit of information about Ginger. Her debut novel, The Nature of Remains, won the AWP Prize for the novel. And AWP is the Association of Writing Programs. I think that's what it is. So that's a pretty big conference that happens yearly. And so that's a big deal to win the prize for the novel. Her short stories, essays, and reviews have appeared in various online and print journals, including Bellevue Literary Review, Necessary Fiction, and West Branch. Ginger holds an MFA in Writing and Literature from the Bennington Writing Seminars. She works as a book coach and a freelance editor, and she teaches writing in nonprofit settings. She's currently at work on a speculative novel exploring the nature of consciousness. Born and raised in Georgia, Ginger now lives in Decatur, Georgia with her husband and their cats. In her free time, she enjoys taking long urban hikes centered around trees, Atlanta's map of the city's champion trees, which I think is really cool. There's actually, Ginger, there's a book about the historical trees of Wisconsin, which is a similar thing, and it's very cool. So I'd be interested to look up a little bit of history about Georgia's trees. So thank you for being here. And if anybody has any technical troubles, just reach out to me in the chat box. I'll be kind of working in the background and then asking Ginger some questions. And again, if you've got questions, let me know in the chat. And when I call your name, you can unmute and ask that directly. So Ginger, welcome. I'll hand the baton to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Christy. I love the intimacy of this. So I have it on the view where I can see everyone's faces. So I feel like you guys are here in my house with me. And Heather, it's so sweet to see you. Thanks for showing up. We met years ago at a writer's retreat in Tennessee. Yeah, so this is really fun. I am going to start with a little slideshow. The town in the Nature of Remains is a fictional town called Fly Shoals, Georgia, and it is created from a lot of towns in this one little area of Georgia. So if you head out 20 East, Highway 20 East, there are all of these little towns, and one of them is called Jackson's Crossroads, and it's known for its amethysts. It has these world-class amethysts, which you would probably never imagined to be true. And so I knew that I was going to work with that in the novel. And then as I started looking at that area, I realized I'm not great with maps and geography, so I had to go out there and drive. So I drove to Jackson's Crossroads and then realized that this was an area where I'd spent a huge amount of time. So I'm going to show a few pictures that I took all of these, and I'm not a photographer, and but you know, these are the ones I actually used for inspiration. All right. So in this area, let's see, I lived here in my 20s. I did my student teaching in this area. We covered the crystals. There, I worked in this golf course. It was a private golf course, but it was very tired and very old. It was just like a cinder block clubhouse and these weathered greens, and that appears in the novel. And then it's a town, this whole region is still went red, in the recent elections. So it's still sort of transitioning. I currently live in Decatur, in DeKalb County, right? And we are largely responsible for the Senate configuration right now, but that isn't this area. This area is still in transition, really. And the novel sort of captures a moment of that. There's a community college that's been built. The community college is offering a nursing program. There are two characters in the novel, Doreen and Lexi, and Doreen is the mother-in-law and Lexi is the daughter-in-law, and Lexi enrolls in a nursing program at the community college, and that sort of sets all of these things in motion. The economy has crashed. It's 2009. There aren't a lot of jobs available. These are two women who would largely be considered expendable anyways. They both have a lot of things they need to get in place before they can have more sovereignty and liberation, though they're not the sort of women who would use words like that. But Doreen still needs her GED, and Lexi needs her nursing degree. She needs to finish her nursing degree. And they are sometimes working at odds, and they're sometimes working, with one another. But they really can't, they don't have any choice but to get along because there are grandchildren involved, and they are primarily, this is on the way back home to Atlanta. It's just a double rainbow. I thought we would enjoy it. There are grandchildren involved. And so of course they care most about the future of their grandchildren, the children's future. And they have to work together for, let's see, am I still sharing the screen? No. Okay. So they have to work together for the future of the children. And that leads Doreen to go against her son, and it leads Lexi to go against her husband. All right, so I'm going to read just the opening chapter. Doreen Swilly walked into her kitchen and found her grown son, Jonathan, passed out at her table. From across the room, she smelled him. Stale beer, last night's whiskey. He'd left the door to the carport open. She slammed it hard. He snorted upright, his red curls slicked flat with sweat across his forehead. You owe me for electric, said Doreen. Air conditioner hasn't cycled off in hours. She went to the coffee pot and measured grounds into a paper filter. Jonathan stretched his legs into the kitchen. That pot's got a timer on it, Mama. You can set it before bed and wake up to fresh hot. I know my own coffee pot. She'd asked for the damn thing last year for her birthday, and Jonathan and his family had given it to her. This year she'd asked for nothing, and nothing was what she got. A tuneless round of happy birthday and a check for $25. Jonathan hadn't even been there, just Lexi and the kids. She poured enough water into the reservoir for a full pot. She took the Tylenol from her windowsill, filled a glass with tap water, and took these things to her son. You plan to tell me what has you at my house when you should be heading to work? Me and Lexi need some time apart. She's too haughty to exist beside. Jonathan shook 4 Tylenol into his palm and chewed them dry. Marital trouble was what Doreen would have guessed. She'd cared for the grandchildren every Sunday since Lexi started nursing school 3 years ago, and since winter she'd been helping on Saturdays too. You and Lexi can't make it through the work week alone now, she said. You need someone to move into your house full time, she said at the table across from her son. Lexi came after me last night, he said, hit me in front of the kids. Doreen checked the soft tissue near Jonathan's eyes, around his lips. She scanned his wrists. She'd seen marks on him in the past months, but only a few, and only from fingernails. Those streaky scabs she recognized. She'd left them long ago on his father. On Lexi, she'd spied finger-shaped bruises along her upper arms, but nothing worse. Jonathan's eyes were bloodshot from liquor, but he had no darkening, no swelling. If Lexi had struck him, it had been with an open palm. You hit her back? I got her to stop is all. Well, that could mean anything. Jonathan ran a fingernail along a scratch in the table, deepening it. I need to stay gone for a while. Me and Lexi need time to cool down. Doreen wanted to ask her son if he'd done his drinking before or after his fight with his wife. She wanted to know what her grandchildren had been witness to, but such questions would make him stop talking. This is your home, she said, and it always will be, but that doesn't mean you should be here. The last time I left her, Lexi came by here to see me every day. We worked things out. Juliet was an infant then. Thomas wasn't even born. Lexi herself wasn't but 19. We're not so changed from then, me and Lexi. Is that so? Doreen stood to get their coffee. She wouldn't pretend to understand the vagaries of a long marriage. Her relationship with Jonathan's father had been a brief thing, 4 years and never legalized. Since then, she'd only been involved with her boss, Emmanuel Bird Markston. She knew from observing Bird's relationship with his wife that her affair with him was nothing like a marriage. As for Jonathan and Lexi, they shared a sibling-like familiarity mysterious to her. She poured 2 mugs and brought them to the table. Jonathan slurped coffee over his tongue and gagged. I'm going to have to eat something, he said. I went to Merle's bar after I left Lexi and stayed till closing. So the drinking came after the fighting. It was the progression Doreen had hoped for. She checked the time. Close to 8, but Bird only came in 2 or 3 days a week now and rarely before 11. 15 years her senior, he'd been more or less retired for a decade. I have time to make us something, she said. A familiar tension grew between them. Jonathan was 9 the first time he got sent home for defending her honor on the playground, 12 the first time he told her the kids at school were right. She was a whore. Even now, after so much time had passed that everyone in Fly Shoals, including Doreen and Bird, mostly overlooked their affair, Jonathan could still grow angry enough about it to pick a fresh fight. But this morning, he reached across the table and took her hand. Pancakes? His calluses were rough against her palm. The strangeness of her boy having grown into a man caught her. Once he'd been a creature entirely in her care. Get the Bisquick, she said. He stood to gather ingredients. When he was a child, she'd sometimes come into the kitchen on a weekend morning to find the eggs and the milk, the butter lined on the counter. His way of saying, please, Mama? She caught him now in side view as he bent into the fridge. His ears had the same clamshell shape she'd traced with a fingernail when he was a newborn. She'd been so pleased that he'd gotten his father's ears. Her own stuck out. He'd gotten Billy's pale skin too, Billy's red hair. Jonathan motioned toward the counter where the ingredients were lined. He looked so much like Billy in that moment Doreen turned away. How had she not understood that she found her son beautiful only because he was hers? His father, she remembered as an ugly man. I
Wow,
hope you guys have some questions for me.
yeah, that's a great opening. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking about just the way you describe a mother and son relationship, especially one that, it starts out with a lot of tension and then it grows to that really intimate moment of just seeing him as beautiful. And I mean, one of my questions, a great piece of literature is one in which the characters change. And this first chapter, we certainly see and learn about these characters that are, in a tough position in one way or another. And so there's opportunity for change one way or another, whether it's change for the good or change for the worse. So I guess, can you tell us a little bit about, from that chapter, um, maybe just when you were writing the novel, what did the characters unfold in a way that you kind of anticipated it was going to go? Did they unfold in an unexpected way towards changes that you didn't necessarily plan for in the beginning, but opened up towards the end?
Well, that's a good question. They didn't change as much as I hoped they would, but they changed more than I thought they might in my most fearful moments. So one of the reasons that I wrote the book, I was interested in the nature of human change and in generational trauma and in redemption and in how families sort of overcome these patterns of violence, especially when you're dealing with, long-term struggle or poverty, lack of education, lack of resources, those sorts of things. And there is a geology metaphor that undergirds the whole novel. It's divided into thirds. And so I'm looking at orogeny and weathering and sort of crystal formation, orogeny, crystallization, and weathering. So I'm looking at crystal formation and paralleling that with the human soul. Because I think change occurs. I think redemption doesn't occur and then we're finished with it, right? It's moment by moment by moment by moment. And so there are moments where Jonathan, who is one of the more complicated characters in the novel, as you would expect. Oh, hi, Jody. There are moments where he is redeemed, and then there are moments where he is completely himself again. And if you've ever been, in a relationship that you needed to get out of, right? That's part of the challenge, is that you do see the moments where the person before you is redeemed and then the moments that they are not redeemed. I mean, we're all like that. And then if a person is prone to violence, then the difference between their moments of redemption and their unredeemed moments are bigger.
Thanks. I see, Heather, you've got a question. And then Doug.
Yes. Hey, that reading was really, really good. I love it. I was wondering, we talked about how the characters changed through the course of the novel. I'm curious how the novel itself evolved throughout the writing process. From your initial conception of it as you went through, I'm guessing, various rounds of edits, revisions. How did the finished product differ from perhaps what your initial idea for the story was?
I'm a very slow writer. You know that. It takes me a long time to finish things. And so there are two storylines in the novel. There's the storyline that's taking place during the economic recession of 2009 and sort of heightening everyone's worst tendencies, right? And then there is this alternate storyline that takes place between 1958 and 1960. So the civil rights movement is just arriving to Fly Shoals. And that storyline centers around Bird that we heard mentioned. That story, he's been Doreen's lover for 30 years. His family is one of the founding families of this town. He's a person with a lot of wealth and a lot of power. And he's also a person who is able to behave very poorly and get away with it. And so we see him as a young man, and he has a moment where he makes a choice, right? Something goes very wrong in his life, and he can become a person who tries to change things for the better, or he can use his name and his wealth and his power to hide this thing that has happened, and he chooses to hide it. And that sort of explains to us why he's broken in the particular way he is in 2009. But that second storyline, that storyline from the 1958 to 1960, that came in second. So I had written the present day storyline, and I couldn't, there was no way that Bird, as he is now, could tell us what he had done, right, in a way that where we would be able to have compassion for him and love him, or maybe just me, but he couldn't do that for me. So I needed to go back and see him as a boy, right, and see him when he had this really pure soul and this opportunity, and he turned away. And at any point he could have decided to say, hey, everybody, here's this thing I did, but he never does. And he doesn't at any point in this. It comes back around, and he still makes a bad choice. So that's not too much of a spoiler.
Thank you, Heather. How about you, Doug?
Well, she may have just answered it. I was wondering why you decided to set the present day story in the time of the big recession. You said, I guess it was a time when everybody's personality would be most heightened. Is that essentially what you said?
Absolutely. And then the other thing that happened is I started writing it around that time. So I started writing it around 2010 and finished in 2017. And then it takes a while, right, for a book to make its way into the world. So it won a contest in 2018, and 2020 it was published, and now here we are. So my husband is a geologist, and he works in aggregates, which is like all of your building materials for roads and that sort of thing. And that industry was severely affected by the economic crash. So he was coming home, in tears because of all of the people that had been laid off. And then he worked for a large company, but it's selling crushed rock to small mom and pop cement plants, right? Concrete plants. And so these concrete plants were closing, and they were closing. And so a lot of people in our lives in rural Georgia, their lives were falling apart. And that's also, it was just, I had a lot of feelings around all of that and started writing about it. So one of the characters in here has a concrete plant. Jonathan works at the concrete plant.
Yeah. Thank you for those questions and the answers, Ginger. I have one more question I wanted to ask you just before maybe you could read another little excerpt for us. You were talking about the geology and the weathering and the crystal formation and how it parallels, or it's a metaphor for the human soul. And I wondered, without revealing too much of the story, is there something you can tell us about crystal formation that would shed a little light on what we can expect in the story? Well, I think that's really cool. And I know you've got different sections in the book that start
Yeah.
out with the geology essays. And so I love how those things work together, how the aspect of place and landscape really fold into a story. And so I'm just kind of curious how that might work without revealing too much.
Oh, I love that question. I can completely geek out on the rock facts. So amethysts form deep, deep, deep in the earth, right? At some point, however many hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, there's this event deep underground, and the plates are shifting. All of this stuff is happening, and then you have this magma that shoots through. It just shoots through everything that's going on. And as that magma, and I'll read one of the geology sections, but as that magma climbs upward, everywhere that there's a little space that it can sort of get stuck and cool, that's where crystals form. And so the parallel for me is that I feel like we're all that magma in life. I mean, it's just really hard to ever feel that you are, for me, I feel it's very hard to ever feel that I am calm enough to be present and loving in the way that I most want to be. And the more that I can find one of those little spaces in my life, or create one of those little spaces, the more that I feel my soul can form. And it was relevant in my thinking about generational trauma and family patterns and patterns of violence, because I mean, the characters in this novel don't have a lot of downtime. I mean, they're not characters who are going to encounter really yoga and meditation and these sorts of things that I find very helpful. And they also just don't have much time to pause and do those things, right? So church on Sunday morning, and then the rest of the week, you're back in the madness of it. And I was raised in Snellville, Georgia, when it was still one of these little towns and a working class family. And we worked hard all the time. There wasn't a lot of time to like calm down and say, oh, I shouldn't have, yelled at my kids like that. So I thought that the metaphor worked. Yeah, I'll read a geology section. I like those sections. Let's see. It's divided into thirds. This is the very first one, orogeny. Georgia breaks in two along the fall line, a geological boundary that marks the shift from the packed red clay of the northern Piedmont to the friable soils of the southern coastal plains. Georgia's southern soils are the forgotten floors of past seas. They break easily for spade or shovel, and when cultivating them, it's not unusual to unearth the tiny whorls of ancient fossilized sea creatures. North of the fall line in the Piedmont, fossils are uncommon. There, the soil is the result of weathered crystalline rock. These decaying rocks are older than ocean sands, older than fossilized sea creatures, older than carbon-based life itself. The rocks of the Piedmont were formed during a long ago mountain making, an orogeny so distant that the mountains themselves, the Appalachians, are now worn short and smooth. Millions of years of erosion have weathered away thousands of feet of stone. Soils as old as these are weary of change. They compact underfoot, resist both hand and plow. Too much has already been asked of them. But the Piedmont soils are not without magic. In both moonlight and sunlight, they glitter with the remains of deep earth's ruined crystals, her micas and pyrites, her pulverized quartzes. The hard red clay of North Georgia sparkles in the faintest light, and like the people it supports, hopes that this small display will be enough, hopes that no one will go digging, searching for more.
Well, when you read that, I can certainly see how that could be a great metaphor for generational trauma. Just it's very deeply rooted, all of those things.
Yeah.
That eventually it's hard to break that cycle. Yeah. Joni, and you can go ahead, and then Jody just had a nice comment for you.
Well, I was in a roundtable for a while where there was a fellow writing a novel where he was trying to do what you're doing. He was writing more about the topography of the land, and it was almost like a character in and of itself, but he was missing the mark on how it connected with the story. So I think it would be really interesting to hear. I loved what you said before about how we're like that magma and crystallizing and so on. But if you could pick one of the characters that you just read about and just tell us a little bit about how you connected them to this passage you just read, because that you said that's the first section, and we heard chapter 1. So how did you, just without revealing too much, how did you connect them?
Well, as far as connecting them at the plot level, I mean, there's the metaphorical connection, right? But there's a very strong plot level connection in that Jonathan becomes a crystal thief. And I met one of these crystal thieves. So I was in North Carolina with my husband years ago. I mean, this was in my early 20s, before I had any idea I would ever write a novel. And we saw a gem show off on the side of the road. And so we just swooped in to go see the gemstones. And there was this whole table full of amethysts. And there were two men working it, one about my age and one who was probably in his 60s. And so the 60-year-old man was, and he was clearly in charge. He was off. He was not paying attention to what was happening. And the young man proceeded to tell me that all of these amethysts had come from the General Jackson Crossroads area in Georgia, and that they had stolen most of them. And he told me how they stole them. And they would map it. They would map out the crystal seams, and then they would take these backhoes and they would go into either, farmland where no one was there in the evenings, or public lands, and steal them. So that really just stayed with me. So in the novel, Jonathan loses his job, right? The plant, well, he doesn't, anyhow, I won't give that piece away. He no longer has a job, and it's exciting how he ends up without one. And he falls in with a crystal thief. And so he starts stealing these amethysts. And I met that crystal crook, but then also there's this fun piece where, being married to a geologist, when we lived in Nevada for a period of time, and he was in underground mining. And so they would blast, right? And it would open up the vugs, the big hollows where the crystals grow. And then and this was a gold mine. So huge economic connections, but all mining shut down. And they waited for this guy to drive in from California and go in and chip out all of these little crystals. That was things like barite, stibnite, apparently they're pretty rare, and chip out all these little crystals. And the miners weren't supposed to steal them. I mean, everyone did, but they weren't supposed to steal them. They were all supposed to go with this crystal crook who made so much money somehow doing this that he could shut down the whole gold mine. I mean, I don't know what the behind the scenes configuration was, but yeah.
That's pretty funny that they weren't supposed to steal. They were supposed to give it to the crystal crook who's stealing the crystals, or is that what you mean?
He had a contract. They weren't supposed to break them out though, but everyone did. I mean, just like in the diamond mines, you smuggle out diamond. It's crazy, right? This is the economic resources.
Yeah. Well, you've kind of explained a little bit about your research with the photos and things like that, but I was reading one of your interviews on Fiction Writers Review, which, by the way, is a great site if anybody's interested in learning more about fiction in general, different books. There's always great reviews and interviews, and one of them is with Ginger. And you talk about your research saying that your habits aren't about creating a place so much as grounding yourself to the place you already know. So I'm just wondering about, I know you took a trip and I know you took photos. Was there other research that you did that just helped you build your story from there? Was it just conversations with your husband as a geologist himself? Was there, what was your process in developing the research for your story?
Well, as far as the geology piece goes, I actually read a lot of very dry textbooks and spoke to people who are experts in crystal, in the local crystal geology, and that part was fun. So I did that, and then there was a lot that I had to research historically. One of the characters leaves the cotton gin here in Atlanta, and I knew the cotton gin existed. My grandmother and my great aunts were raised there. Their mother worked at the cotton gin. They were raised in Cabbagetown and the mill towns, but I didn't, besides family lore, I didn't know any of the details. I didn't know who owned it. I didn't know if it was unionized. I didn't actually know what happened in there, besides some sort of, I'd gotten, I mean, my grandmother would say that my great grandmother's job was to do something like that. So there was a lot of research around that sort of thing. And then there was research, there's some bodies that get buried. So I talked to the body farm, and I think they're in North Carolina, you know, because bodies decompose at different rates depending on where they're buried, and what they were wearing. And so I tried to get all of the details right. I interviewed a friend. There's an insurance line. Doreen works in an insurance company, and when it looks like she's going to be laid off or fired, she decides to steal the company. So I had a few long conversations with a friend who sells insurance, and, you know, trying to figure out how I could steal his company. he was very helpful. I like the research part.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Do you have another excerpt that you would like to read?
Let's see. I don't know. Let's see. I always worry. I don't care about spoilers. I am the type of person who reads the end of a book to know whether or not I'm going to read the whole thing. So I'm sorry if I'm not going to read the end of the book, but I'm going to read what I want to read. And if it spoils it for you, then you save the $18. All right. So this is close. It's not the end, but it's closer to the end. So Jonathan, problematic, abusive husband. He has, it's Crystal Crook, right? He's accidentally dug up a body and he's sitting beside it. And this ties into what I was talking about with this idea of redemption. When he was finished, what he'd found was a pitiful thing. He'd done his best with the bones, even the spongy, porous ones, and the white flecks skinnier than a snake's spine. It was the hair that told him he'd found a woman. Even in death, her hair was a thing of wonder, at least a yard of it colored dirt red, same as the remnants of the shroud that once wrapped her. Jonathan took off his t-shirt and draped it over his find. The shirt collapsed into her hollows, nothing but cotton slump where breasts and hips and a good soft belly used to be. Jonathan had gotten everything but her legs. The legs, he figured, were still in the cornfield. The sun bore down through breaks in the pine boughs. Jonathan sat beside the girl and lit a cigarette. For all of his remembered life, his mother had been involved with Bird Markston. He'd always known who the man was. When Jonathan first met Lexi, she'd said, Johnny fucking Swilly, and he'd said, Lexi fucking Hart. They'd never met, but they sure as hell weren't strangers. This was the sort of town he thought he lived in. This was the way he'd believed the world to be. Yet Jonathan had never heard mention of the secret he'd unearthed, this secret that belonged to the man his mother loved. He couldn't imagine that his mother knew of this. Whatever her faults, she wasn't a woman who would stay with a man who hid a woman's body in the ground. Unless the story she'd been told of it was so tightly woven, so cleverly woven that she was left no gap to imagine the remains Jonathan smoked beside now. No gap to think on what a human body reduced to without embalming chemicals in a casket. Almost nothing, that was the answer. This woman was nearly gone. Jonathan realized that the world was so vast, there could only be a pretending at human transparency, only lies of understanding. What could be known of any single person on this planet, truly known, was infinitesimal. Jonathan himself was minute, less than a puff of air. He would disappear. What waited was his own blink out. This blink out might be the single irreducible truth of human existence. Jonathan took the skull in his hand and wrapped all that hair around and around it like padding. Here he was, holding proof of the great blink out, life's only transparency, yet he found it impossible to comprehend. Mortality could only be glimpsed in dots and flashes. It was too much to hold for longer than a breath. A clear, bright, high, steady terror, that's how he felt. Even if the only reason to stay alive was to avoid this horror, it was reason enough. He tied all the bones into a misshapen hobo's sack. Nothing mattered, not for this girl, not for him, yet he couldn't leave her here exposed in a clearing. In discovering her, he'd pulled her back from eternity's maw in some small way. He was all she had now, and she'd delivered him onto himself. There was nothing special about Fly Shoals, nothing special about the life he'd created, nothing special about the life he'd lost. The thing to do was to stop his hiding and hoarding, his boasting and pretending, stop imagining himself capable of being tomorrow someone he plainly was not today. All of that was over. He'd find Lexi. That was what he'd try first. She might have him back or she might not. His children might love him or they might not. He might spend his life living with his mother and working alongside her, or he might not. His heart might melt in his chest from the pain of his own existence. But if he didn't get out of these woods, what this bag of bones had of life would be all that he had too: a secrecy, a hiding, a decay. What a waste of so brief a miracle to live as if already dead.
Wow, that's
Thanks,
awesome.
Katie.
Yeah. And that's not too much of a reveal. That's just enough to whet our appetite to want more. That's awesome. Well, and I want to say too, you talked about you could save the $18 if you felt it was too much of a spoiler, but I know that you are giving a portion of your proceeds to a place called Circle of Love from any proceeds from the book. So do you want to tell us a little bit about Circle of Love?
I would like to, yes. So the novel clearly is dealing with domestic violence in part, right? Generational trauma, domestic violence. And Circle of Love is a women and children's shelter in Greensboro, Georgia. It's the only one in a fairly large geographical area. It's new, I mean, about a decade old, but and it was begun because a woman was killed and there was nowhere that she could have gone. And so some friends of hers started Circle of Love. So I'm giving a portion of the proceeds to Circle of Love. And then the other thing, the country club that I mentioned working at earlier. So one of the women that I worked with, this was before Circle of Love existed, and she was in an abusive relationship and trying to get out of it, and spent several evenings at my kitchen table. So I thought of her a lot as I was writing.
Thank you. I know, Heather, you've got a quick question. You want to ask that?
My dog decided to join as well.
Dog is very
Otherwise, he keeps coming in and out, in and out, in and out. I have to hop up and get the door. I was wondering if you wanted to share two things. One, I always love hearing what people are reading, if you're reading anything good these days or anything that influenced this book, perhaps. And then my second question, and just ignore if I'm asking too many questions, but is if you wanted to share more about your current work in progress, your current writing project.
Yes. Okay. So I just read the most incredible book. I recommend it to everybody. It's called Nupaming, A Cure for White Ladies. I don't know if anyone's heard of this. So the author is Leanne Betesemosake Sampson, and she is Canadian. She's Indigenous Canadian. She's written several books, but this one, so there's a character who is dead and is at the bottom of a frozen lake. And it's an Indigenous philosophy. So the character is still completely involved with a flock of birds, with a moose, with a young boy who comes to watch birds, with an old man, an old woman who both know the person in the lake and come to visit her. For the most part, the only pronoun used for every character in the novel is they, because all of the characters are ultimately completely interdependent with one another. The youngest human character, the boy, is a he. Everyone else is mostly a they, and they're just enmeshed in the mystery. I can't recommend it highly enough. It was so good. And if you, so Samuel Beckett, he No How On, I don't know if anyone's read this, but he has this man and he's sitting alone in a room and he is sort of pondering existence and death and what happens next. And also it's a parallel for writing. But this is sort of the opposite of Beckett. Like I finished No How On and felt so lonely and in all of existence, and I finished Nupaming, A Cure for White Ladies, and thought this is it. This is my ontology. I want to live in this existence. So it's very good. And then I'm currently working on a novel. I mean, yeah, it is. I'm exploring the nature of consciousness, which is one of the reasons I read Nupaming, and it's set in South Georgia, and it's set along a river, and there are lots of swamps, and I'm working with artificial intelligence. It's a speculative novel, so there are a couple of characters who are AIs.
Thank you. And I put a link to Nupaming in the chat box if anybody's interested in checking it out. It looks like it's the University of Minnesota Press. So That's pretty cool. Um, so, one more question for you, Ginger. I know that you are an editor, and I'm just wondering how, when you're, working as an editor, how reading someone else's work and helping them form their work into this great book enhances the work that you do
Oh,
for yourself.
yeah. Um, well, I am often envious of how easily other people can create narratives, or maybe I'm envious of how easily I can see the narrative arc in other people's work. And it'll take me a really long time and a lot of layering to get to the arc, I mean, The Nature of Remains has a very strong plot. It's plot driven, but the plot came last. It took me a while to get there. So I'm very much helped by helping other people create plot and narrative. It's also just nice to use a different part of my brain.
Yeah, perfect. So, are you taking on new clients
I
now?
have space for two.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. I have a novel that's like deep in a dark drawer somewhere, but it's very much supposedly set in place and revolves around the landscape. So it's always nice to find other books like yours that mirror that idea and just explore the potential. So it's good to know you've got some space available. Does anybody else have any questions or anything else that you'd like to share about just the book itself, about Georgia? Do you want to share anything about, you talked about hiking around the trees of Georgia. What is that like? What do you mean when you say that?
So Trees Atlanta has pulled together a map of all of Atlanta's champion trees. So we geek out and pull the map up on the phone and then walk to all of these trees and visit them. And I have been taking pictures. I've only started taking pictures during the pandemic, but I'm taking pictures through the seasons to try and track them. The most interesting thing about that for me has been I started this during the pandemic. I mean, occasionally I would look at one of the champion trees. So I have discovered that a champion cherry may only be, this big around, and I know I probably just sound completely ignorant to have not known this, but so a champion cherry might be like this, and then a champion oak could be almost the size of this room. That has been really surprising.
So what makes it a champion tree when they say that? What does that mean exactly?
Oh, it's age.
Okay.
Yeah, it's age. Yeah, I've been having a really interesting experience lately with trees since reading Nupaming and working on consciousness with the novel, right? So I'll just share some geek out facts that I've learned about trees. So the tree's roots are about 2/3 broader than its canopy. And then it has this, the mycelial network. Everyone may have heard of this, like the worldwide, web for trees. And it sends, so trees they're all connected in the forest, and they're sending the food and nutrients to each other and deciding who will live and who gets water, and they communicate about drought and all of these things. So when you are seeing a forest, like the majority of the life and the energy is underground, which has just been, I don't know, I highly recommend standing in your backyard and looking around and thinking the majority of what I see is actually taking place under my feet. It's really an expansive experience.
Yeah, that's really cool. That sounds like a great novel in itself. One that's based on trees. So
Maybe
keep
it's the
taking
Oprah
photos.
story. I haven't read that yet, but
Yeah.
it keeps coming recommended.
Yeah. And I think that's what Heather was just talking about.
No, I haven't read it yet. Have you? I have read The Hidden Life of Trees. I haven't seen the illustrated version.
And I said the wrong thing. I called it the understory. Yeah, it's kind of about that. I mean, other things too, but huge epic passage of time, and then, but that's kind of, that undergirds the whole story.
I have it on the shelf. Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, it's really good.
Well, that's awesome. Well, we're getting towards near the end of the hour.
Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
It
well,
was
thank
wonderful.
you, Ginger. It's so nice to have you online. I really do love doing these events because it's just a great opportunity to meet authors from near and far. And I'm excited to take a look at your book. I will drop the links in the chat box one more time for everyone if you want to visit Ginger's website, take a look at some of her other interviews and her other work, and a link to bookshop.org, which is a great place to purchase books online as an alternative to Amazon, and the proceeds from those books go towards independent bookstores. So it's kind of like keep our small communities going. And thanks everyone for being here. This will be recorded and up on YouTube if you want to watch it again, or if you want to check out any of the other past readings. We've got some more coming up in March and April, and scheduling some in May. So take a look at hiddentimberbooks.com. I'd love to see you all online again. Thanks, Jody, for being here. Jody's one of our past event participants as well. So go to YouTube and check out her book, Guns Under the Bed. And all right, thanks for being here, everybody. I so appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.